Archdiocese of Omaha. Jim had a powerful encounter with the Lord as a student at Benedictine College when his college roommate invited him to join his Bible study. He served as a founding missionary for Focus at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in 1999. So this is a homecoming of sorts for him. During his 18 years on Focus staff, Jim served as a missionary, team leader, and regional director, supporting chaplains and campus staff around the country. Jim began his work with the Archdiocese of Omaha in 2017. Captivated by the Archdiocesan vision of one church encountering Jesus, equipping disciples, and living mercy, Jim now leads a team dedicated to supporting parishes and training disciples for mission. Jim holds a master's degree in pastoral theology from the Ave Maria University. He is a coach and a consultant and the author of A Clear Path: How to Make Missionary Disciples in Your Parish. He and his wife Kim live in Bellevue, Nebraska, in St. Bernadette's Parish, and have 6 children from college to preschool. Jim, welcome to Serra Meets.
Thank you, Mike. As Mike said, this really is a bit of a homecoming for me. A couple ways. Some of you who are here in person just got to hear from Father Ben Holdren. In 1999, one of the first guys to get involved in Bible study when I showed up as a brand new missionary at the University of Nebraska was a guy named Ben Holdren. So it was a real joy to be able to hear his presentation ahead. Sorry for those of you who are online who missed it. Also, this facility, this beautiful seminary, St. Gregory the Great Seminary, this chapel, right there. I sat and discerned my vocation, no exaggeration, in this chapel. I was not a seminarian. I was just on a retreat as a missionary, accompanying some other young men. And after hearing beautiful exposition after exposition of the glories of the priesthood, I was pretty sure that I was supposed to propose to my girlfriend, Kim. And so I left that discernment retreat convinced that I needed to go buy a ring. So I know at least one vocation came from that retreat. And the Serra Club is very special to me. You know, as a brand new missionary starting out, before anybody knew what Focus was, a man by the name of Jim Herder, who was a longtime Serran, God rest his soul, he's now deceased, he was in the Omaha Club. And Jim was my pediatric dentist, which, as a side note, I don't know how you make a living as a pediatric dentist when your last name is Herder. must have been God's grace. But he was the very first person to join my support team as a missionary. And he didn't just do that. He turned in the names of all the other club members to me and said, you tell him I said to give you that you should give them a call. So the Serra Club was always an oasis for myself and for other missionaries, just to be able to share what we were doing. And the enthusiasm and the support, both financially, but really the encouragement, was unbelievable. So this really is a homecoming, and I'm joyful to be with you. I got to talk a little bit about the fundamentals of encounter. And to begin, what I want to do is I want to maybe name a phenomenon that you might be experiencing. And that is, maybe you've noticed that the language is changing in the church. Maybe you've noticed that it feels like someone has moved the goalposts as to what it means to be a faithful Catholic. Now, I wouldn't blame you. You can keep this in your own heart. But I wouldn't blame you if you thought to yourself, I've been Catholic all my life. Actually, I've been the best Catholic I know all my life. And I don't know what to make of this new language that is showing up in the church. From the Second Vatican Council to John the 23rd, John Paul II, Paul VI, Pope Benedict, Pope Francis, words like encounter or missionary disciple, or this insistence that we are called to a personal, conversational, intimate relationship with our Lord. For many of us, myself included, that, and I know I'm a little younger than some folks here, that wasn't the expectation I was given. And so what I want to do is I want to break down just one of those terms, encounter. What does the church mean when she talks about encounter? All of us are called to be missionary disciples, but that calling begins with an encounter. And so what I want to do is I want to give you two things. I want to go through Luke chapter 24, the story of the road to Emmaus, and I want you to see what Jesus does and then what we're called to do in response. So here we go. This is from Luke chapter 24. Now, this is Easter Sunday afternoon, right? Jesus is risen from the tomb. He's appeared to the women. Mary Magdalene, Peter, and John have run to the tomb. And somewhere in the middle of this, these two disciples decide, okay, we're done. And they decide to leave Jerusalem. We pick up the story with them on a road walking away from Jerusalem to a small little city called Emmaus. Verse 13. That very day, two of them were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing together, Jesus himself drew near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What is this conversation which you are holding with each other as you walk?" Okay, first point. Jesus meets us in our discouragement. Jesus meets us in our discouragement. Notice how gently he comes to them. I mean, he almost literally sneaks up on them. They don't recognize him, not because he's wearing a disguise, but because of their eyes. And he goes right to their disappointment, right to their source of confusion and pain and frustration. It goes like this, right? What is this conversation which you are holding with each other as you walk? And it stops them dead in their tracks. And they stood still, and looking sad, said, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" Now that's really funny. Jesus is the only one who really knows what's going on. I mean, this is great. And you know, some of us, like, do you know how I would respond to this? You can guess how I might respond to this. Watch how Jesus responds. What things? Right? This is with your children, your fallen away siblings, your niece, your nephew. When they say ridiculous things, the temptation is to answer them and set them straight, right? And Jesus just draws, what things? And then they tell this amazing story. And this, I think, is the most significant part of the story that I don't want you to miss. They begin to tell Jesus that he was a prophet of great renown in word and in deed. But then, of course, he was crucified. But they don't stop there. And now, 3 days later, there's this report that he's been raised from the dead. Some women from our party went, and he's not there. And they said they saw angels. Now, you might at this point, if you stop reading, be tempted to think that they're just writing off crazy Mary Magdalene. She's a little eccentric. She takes the late night holy hours. She's just not, just Mary. She's always the first one at the meetings, always the last one at the meetings. Maybe they're writing off Mary Magdalene, but they proceed to say, and 2 others from our group ran to the tomb. That's Peter and John. I don't think you get more credibility in this community than Peter and John. And then they're like, but they didn't see him. And so they're continuing to walk away. This is what I want to make sure you don't miss here. They are not lacking information. They know who Jesus was. They were faithful disciples. They believed in him. They certainly know about his death, and they've heard about the resurrection. What they're missing is an encounter. And that's what Jesus does. He comes to them and he meets them right in the midst of their discouragement and confusion and frustration. And then he begins to make fun of them. Right? Immediately after, they say, that Peter and John didn't see him. Jesus says, "Oh, foolish men, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken." Now, depending on your relationship with your earthly father or maybe your, early pastors, you might hear that in a different way. I think that's a little playful because Jesus begins then to open up the scriptures to them. And that's the second thing that Jesus does. Jesus changes our perspective. First, he comes to meet us in our disappointment, in our confusion, in our sadness. But then secondly, he comes and he changes our perspective because we have expectations. We have expectations for how the music is going to be. And we have expectations about what the family reunions are going to be like. And how soon they're going to get married, and how quickly they'll have grandchildren, and how often those grandchildren will come over. We have socioeconomic expectations. We have hopes and dreams for our country. And on and on and on and on. And they aren't bad. Especially in a group like this, I'm sure all of those expectations are good. But in the midst of our discouragement and our confusion and our sadness, Jesus says, can I raise the veil a little bit? Can I help you see a little bit deeper? Can I help you see how in a fallen world, there is no escape from sacrifice? In a fallen world, there is no escape from sacrifice. And whatever that sacrifice, our sin, someone else's sin, nobody's sin, whatever that disappointment is, it can bear fruit for the salvation of souls. And so Jesus changes their perspective by doing a quick Bible study on everything in the Old Testament that refers to him. I want you to see the pattern. Every time someone comes to Jesus and they want to talk about taxes or corrupt government or corrupt religious leaders, he dodges the question. I'm going to paraphrase a little bit because the conversations that this happens, it happens again and again and again and again. But essentially, every time somebody wants to talk to Jesus about politics or a style of worship or taxes or anything other than himself or the Father, he says, let's talk about the Father's love for you. The timing you have, the expectations for the political freedom of your faith. Let's talk about how much the Father loves you. Now, I want to pause here. I had intended to do this at the beginning, but better late than never. I want you to just take a moment, like a second, and let the Lord open your heart. Just ask for the gift of openness. Lord, I'm open to whatever you want to do, however you want to change my perspective. Because he never stops coming to us in our discouragement. He never stops trying to change our perspective and raise our vision. Third thing Jesus does is he feeds us with the word of life and the bread of life. We already talked about the word of life, right? He does this Bible study, all the things that refer to him in the Old Testament. But then, as they're getting ready to stop for the night, he kind of pretends he's going further. And they're like, no, stay with us. And so he does. And then in that moment, he takes the bread, he breaks it, and their eyes are opened, and they recognize him. You can see the same movements in the liturgy, in the Mass. We're fed with the word of life, and then we're fed with the bread of life. But here's what I don't want you to miss. As they recognized him, they said to each other, Jesus disappears, said, "Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road, while he opened to us the scriptures?" And they rose, and that same hour they returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 gathered together and those who were with them. And that group says, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." And they're like, "Yeah, and us." And they told how they recognized him in the breaking of the bread. Do you see how this encounter has made them missionary? The journey that took them all afternoon, they seem to do in a quick hour. It's only from an encounter with Jesus that we can truly become missionary. I wish there were another way. I mean, I'm sad to say that early years as a professional missionary, I tried the other ways. Maybe if I'm cool enough, right? Maybe if I'm fill in the blank. It's only from a personal encounter with Jesus, his peace, his love, his joy, that we can be the missionary disciples that we're called to be. And I'm just going to raise this a little bit. You actually can't not be missionary if you've had that encounter. Remember all those weird stories in the scriptures where Jesus heals somebody and then he immediately says, "Don't tell anybody"? That's so weird. I mean, Lord, isn't the whole point that we're supposed to be telling people? And there's a reason for that in the time of his ministry. But when Jesus says, "Your faith has saved you, go in peace, don't tell anybody," how does that go? They're like, "Okay, well, I mean, you're obviously the Messiah, so whatever you say, my lips are sealed." It never works. They blab it everywhere. They can't stop. They can't not tell of their encounter. So I would encourage you to consider that's your test, whether or not you have had that encounter, whether or not you've let the Lord into your discouragement, whether you've really let him feed you with his word, change your perspective, and feed you with the bread of life. There's no shame in needing a renewed encounter. All of the rituals and routines of the church are designed to help us have a daily encounter with the Lord, an hourly encounter with the Lord, whether it be prayer or the sacraments. All of it's designed for that. So what I want to do now is I want to help you see, well, if this is what Jesus is doing, if Jesus is coming to us in our distraction and he's changing our perspective with the Word of God and he's feeding us, how are we to respond? Well, there's 3 habits of missionary disciples. Just want to highlight 3. There's lots of things that missionary disciples do. They're eminently fruitful, and there's all sorts of fruit, all different kinds. But there's 3 that are common to every vocation, every circumstance, every state of life. First, prayer. Honest, daily conversations with him about, not that it only has to be this, but about your disappointments. If we have the eyes to see it, what Jesus does is he draws them into prayer. He cares about what they care about. He knows and understands and empathizes with their confusion. When you read the journals of the saints, their prayer is shockingly honest and, dare I say, even a little sassy. When you read the dialogue between Jesus and Mother Teresa, you're like, wow, this sounds like a lover's spat. Oh yeah, he was her spouse. You see a playful, honest conversation when you read the prophets, when you read Moses, again and again and again. And so what I would encourage you to do is to make your prayer, particularly your intercession, because let's be honest, you're calling the Lord to do something in terms of the stirring of vocations, in terms of a renewal of faith, that it doesn't feel like he's doing right now. Let him have it in a respectful way, in a trusting way, but be honest about your frustration and your pain and your hurt about friends and loved ones who do not practice the faith. Number 2, friendship. Notice how powerful and consistent community is when people have an encounter with Jesus. These two, although they're headed the wrong direction, they're together. Right? When Jesus sends people out on mission, he sends them out 2 by 2. And when they're restored, when they've had that encounter and they're becoming missionary again, the first thing they do is they run back to the community. Community and friendship are an essential habit of a missionary disciple. But to be clear, I don't just mean with other people who share your values and your state in life and your socioeconomic background. I mean friendship with people who don't. You have to have friendship, of course, with other believers. But evangelization begins, being a missionary begins with simple friendship, kindness. Gone are the days when our first conversation can be about coming back to Mass. We have to develop a relationship and a friendship. We have to begin to, like Jesus, listen to the pain and fear and frustration and disappointment in the hearts of our friends and neighbors, fallen away siblings, children, grandchildren. And I can tell you, that's hard. The proportions are right. We've got 2 ears and 1 mouth. But it's hard to listen, especially to people you know. Because you're like, yeah, if you hadn't done that dumb thing your senior year, and oh, wait, and all of a sudden, we're not listening anymore. To listen and meet people in their disappointment is the second habit. To listen and meet people in friendship is the second habit of missionary disciples. First, prayer, honest, conversational, relational, maybe even sassy prayer. 2, friendship with other believers and with non-believers. And then finally, you need to share your story. Notice what happens. After they've had this encounter, they run back and they share their story. That's the first thing they want to do. They want to tell everybody. They want everybody to know. The whole world, well, at least this little community, their little world, they want them to know. And what do they talk about? Do they begin with a theological treatise? Are they sharing information that this group was lacking? Not really. They're talking about their encounter, how their hearts were burning within them, how Jesus changed their perspective, how they now have hope and peace and joy. And I don't imagine all the confusion was gone, but there was a hope and a peace and a joy that was maybe beyond words. Again, you don't have to be poetic. You don't have to be super eloquent. You have to share the story of what you've experienced. And in our hyper-marketed, produced, sale, everything is selling you something world, a story of something you found that everybody wants, love, hope, peace, joy, that gets attention. But only after you've had an encounter. I'll wrap up here by saying, I know a number of you know that we're in the midst of a Eucharistic renewal in the United States. A formal, programmatic renewal happening, led by the U.S. bishops, but also just a kind of a groundswell of a rediscovery of the Eucharist. And I would say in my own life, I feel like there's several, I'm going to call them Eucharistic miracles. Now, not the kind, and nobody needs to call the Vatican. We're not, nothing reportable. But for me, where the Lord showed me, I'm here. I care, I'm listening to you, and I'm right in the middle of your disappointment. The first happened, it was one of my first, most profound encounters. I was a junior down at Benedictine College, and I was friends with a number of underclassmen, freshmen, who were killed in a car accident. My wife was dating the young man who was killed. I was interested in dating the young woman who was killed. And I found myself spontaneously, unexpectedly, going to confession. And then I found myself face to face with the Lord in the Blessed Sacrament. And he spoke to me. And I heard him because I began from a place of vulnerability. Right? Jesus meets us in our discouragement. I didn't know how to process the grief that I was experiencing. I remember my hands being numb when I first found out about their death. I was with a group and, they were trying to pray the rosary, and I couldn't feel the beads. I had not experienced grief at that level ever before. And all the other superficial things that I usually turned to comfort and distract the deep loneliness and ache in my heart didn't work anymore. And I actually, through God's grace, stumbled in front of the Eucharist, and I prayed honestly. Lord, I don't get it. I don't know what to do. Just speak to me. And he did. And it freaked me out, but that's another story. I eventually said yes. What I want to encourage you to do is, of all these things that we do, our prayer, our friendship, the sharing of our story, of all the things that Jesus does, when he teaches us and feeds us and changes our perspective, it often begins as we're honest about our discouragement and our sadness and our fear. But that's the one place we don't want to be. But it's the one place that Jesus wants to be. Right? He's a good shepherd and he's a good physician. He's like, let's talk about that. What things? Show me where it hurts. So I leave you with this. Let Jesus meet you in your discouragement, in your frustration, in your confusion. It's exactly where he wants to come. Now, I did make a reference to a highly salesy world. This is a homecoming, and it's a fun homecoming for me because I just wrote a book. Literally, I just wrote a book. It's like the paper still, it's all brand new. I've been talking to you about the individual habits of missionary disciples. But when those missionary disciples gather in community, they need a trellis. They need a context and a framework to live and together to share their story with those who do not yet know the Lord or don't know him as fully. The process for a parish community to create a place for missionary disciples to share their faith is called a clear path of discipleship. So this book, A Clear Path, How to Make Missionary Disciples in Your Parish, introduces that concept. In part 2, it talks about how you build it, how do you discern, how do you begin to implement it, how do you communicate it out to the parish at large, how do you help other ministries align to this, and then part 3 is a fictional case study. Father Dave and St. Mary's Parish and their odyssey to build a clear path of discipleship. Somebody writes a mean letter to the bishop. It's very dramatic. Anyway, this book, for those of you who are here in person, I brought a couple of them with me, so be happy to sell you a copy of those. I'll be in the back. For those online, I think they have the website. You can go to clearpathbook.com. But you can find clearpathbook.com. It literally just came up on Amazon today. And so for those of you who are co-laborers with your pastor, and you have a pastor who has a heart to figure out how could our whole parish make missionary disciples, this might be a good book for you. I want to take just a few questions. Yes, sir. Very good. Great, Sarah. What did the Lord say to you? First off, he talked to me about forgiveness because I had a relationship that I needed some sins I needed to repent from, and I needed to seek forgiveness. Second, he said, "Come follow me." And you know what I said? I'm never talking to you again. Because I thought I just got called to be a priest. And I was like, oh no, that was not what the Lord had in mind. Very beautifully, about 10 years later, I said yes, about like 2 months later or 2 weeks later. In the moment, I was a little freaked out. But I was blessed 10 years later to be in that very same chapel doing an extended retreat. And it was only like halfway through the retreat that I realized. And I was able to be in the same spot before the Lord of the Blessed Sacrament and say, okay, Jesus, yes. Thank you for asking. What else? Yes, nice and loud. Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. Where does praise and worship and adoration enter into our prayer life? A couple of things. I would just say praise and worship in the biblical view, and I would say let's think of praise and worship as a very broad thing, not just like a narrow musical style. I happen to love contemporary Christian music and listen to it a lot. But let's think about praise and worship as adoration of the Blessed Sacrament, the Psalms, and of course the music and all of it. Praise chases away the discouragement. And even deeper than a cognitive level, praise changes our perspective. I don't know if you've ever experienced this. The demons don't like praise of the Lord. They can't stand it. It's hard for them to hear. And the discouragement of our heart, even if it's not cognitive, if you can't say, I don't know why I feel better, but I do. The discipline to choose to praise the Lord in the midst of my pain and sadness and confusion, it brings relief. So I'd say it is an essential discipline, regardless of the form. If that's going to be music, a communal gathering, individual time in worship, lean on praise and worship. Great question. What else? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. Like, how do you talk to your neighbor who used to go to Mass, who is Catholic, who's not anymore? How do you not say, why aren't you going to Mass? And I would say, it's not that you can't ask that question, but there is a question of timing, and there's a question of, like, why? Why did they stop going to Mass? And there's usually a why behind that why. Do you know the reason most people stop going to Mass isn't about the music or the preaching? That is the most common thing we complain about 5 minutes after Mass. But it is not the real reason is socially. The connection that I had to this community is gone. My kids just graduated. They're in high school now. I'm not part of our parish school anymore. I don't have any more friends here. My spouse just died. Often there's a social disconnect. So developing a friendship with those individuals and developing, this is the hard part, a purely loving, non-judgmental friendship will in fact give you the opportunity to say, why did you stop going to Mass? And to maybe draw them back, but without being critical. Sometimes the bring them home campaigns, they come home once and they're like, that's right, this is why I left. It's sad to say. I can tell you my neighbor, I don't think he's here, I'm sure he's not, back in Lincoln, Dave had an immaculate lawn. He had a job where he worked really long hours, like 6 days a week, and then 5 days a week, and then he had like or 4 days a week, and then he had 2 like full days off, and he used that to take care of his lawn. And here I am, a missionary, and all of the big growing seasons, fall and spring, they're my growing seasons for souls and missionary work, and so my lawn was a mess. It was awful, and there were kids, and trucks and toys and bare spots and weeds and I'm trying to pray for my neighbor. Here's where the honest prayer comes in. Oh, Jesus, please bless Dave. Because I hate that guy. Like, his lawn is just perfect. Like, why is it so, if he had a job like me where he was actually serving the church, maybe he wouldn't spend so much of his time on this superficial, green grass thing and all this ugliness that comes out in my prayer for Dave. And then I just stop and I let the Lord respond. You know what he showed me? He gave me a memory of Dave out on that lawn playing catch with his children. Every Friday night, every Saturday night. I said, Lord, I don't hate Dave. I'm jealous of Dave. I wish I did that with my kids. Man, that guy is a good dad. I never told Dave about that. But our conversations changed over the fence because my heart changed. We began to talk about faith. He knew I was a missionary. We'd been neighbors for years. But until the Lord changed my perspective, because I prayed honestly, albeit ugly, but honestly at the beginning, until the Lord changed the perspective, my professional missionary stuff made no progress whatsoever. It was only when I had a different perspective about Dave that it was different. Thank you. Joy to be with you all. God bless you. Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Thank you.
Jim, I want to thank you so much for being with all of us today. Your ministry is an inspiration to us all, and your insights, I think, especially your honesty, are very much appreciated. Just a reminder that this presentation is being recorded and will be available on the Serra YouTube channel. Before I end, I want to announce that our speaker next month, on October 14th, will be Sister Roseanne Aachen, prioress of the missionary Benedictine Sisters from Norfolk, Nebraska. She will be speaking on Hope for Vocations. Please plan to join us for her presentation. Thanks to everyone here at the convention and everyone else attending online. Thank you for all you do. Spread the word and the work of Serra. Be safe, pray hard.